Some children have imaginary friends. But what happens when those friends write letters back and the ink bleeds through from the other side? In the bayous of Louisiana, one little girl became a postmaster between worlds, and what she delivered changed her town forever. The summer of 1903 hung over St. Martinville, Louisiana like a wet wool blanket, oppressive and inescapable. The air was thick with moisture and the sweet decay of magnolia blossoms, and even the Spanish moss seemed to drip with humidity. For most residents, it was just another sweltering season in the heart of Cajun country, a time to move slowly, seek shade, and wait for the mercy of autumn. But for the Dupree family, that summer would mark the beginning of something that defied every law of nature and reason they'd ever known. The Duprees lived in a modest but well-maintained house on Rue Saint-Pierre, just 3 blocks from the Evangeline Oak, where legend said the Acadian heroine had waited for her lost love. Jean-Baptiste Dupree was a shopkeeper who sold dry goods and sundries to the town's residents and the plantation families in the surrounding area. His wife, Marie-Thérèse, came from an old Acadian family and spoke French more naturally than English. They had 4 children, but it was their youngest, 8-year-old Celeste, who would become the center of an event so strange that over a century later, people still whisper about it in the streets of St. Martinville. Celeste was a quiet child, small for her age, with dark curls and eyes so deep brown they appeared black in certain light. She was known for spending hours alone in the garden, behind their house, talking to herself or perhaps to the flowers. Her mother never quite knew which. Marie-Thérèse worried sometimes that Celeste was too withdrawn, too different from other children who played raucously in the streets or chattered endlessly at the dinner table. But Jean-Baptiste would simply pat his wife's hand and remind her that some children bloomed in their own time, in their own way. It began in June, on a Tuesday morning, when the postman, Monsieur Hébert, delivered the mail as he did every day, except Sunday. He handed Marie-Thérèse the usual assortment of letters and advertisements, but as she sorted through them at the kitchen table, one envelope caught her attention. It was addressed to Mademoiselle Celeste Dupree in an elegant, old-fashioned script that seemed to flow across the paper like water. The return address simply read, "A friend." Marie-Thérèse felt an immediate unease looking at that envelope. The paper was fine quality but yellowed, as if it had been sitting in a drawer for years. The ink had a strange brownish hue, not the crisp black of modern fountain pens. And there was something else, a faint smell that emanated from it. Not unpleasant exactly, but odd. Like dried flowers and old books and something earthier she couldn't quite identify. She called Celeste in from the garden. The child came running, her small feet leaving muddy prints on the wooden floor, prints that Marie-Thérèse would normally scold her for, but today barely noticed. She handed the letter to her daughter, watching the girl's face carefully. Celeste's eyes widened when she saw the envelope. A smile spread across her face, the kind of delighted smile Marie-Thérèse hadn't seen in months. "Oh," she finally wrote back, Celeste said, clutching the letter to her chest. "I was beginning to think she wouldn't." "Who wrote back, chérie?" Marie-Thérèse asked, her unease growing. "Who is this letter from?" Celeste looked at her mother with those bottomless dark eyes. "From Marguerite, of course. I wrote to her 3 weeks ago, and I've been checking the mail every day. I'm so glad she answered." Marie-Thérèse's throat tightened. She knew of no Marguerite in their acquaintance, no one who would be writing to her 8-year-old daughter. Who is Marguerite? Where does she live? Celeste was already carefully opening the envelope with the reverence of someone handling something precious. "She lives in the cemetery, maman. I told you about her. She's the one who's been sad for so long. I've been trying to cheer her up." The words hit Marie-Thérèse like a physical blow. The cemetery. Her daughter was corresponding with someone who lived in the cemetery. She reached for the letter, but Celeste had already pulled out a single sheet of paper, covered in that same flowing script. The child's lips moved silently as she read, her finger tracing along the lines. "What does it say?" Marie-Thérèse demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "Celeste, show me that letter right now." But Celeste was lost in the words, her face glowing with pleasure. "She says she's so happy to hear from me. She says it's been 40 years since anyone remembered her name. She says the loneliness is the worst part, worse than the cold or the dark. Oh, Maman, I must write back immediately. She needs a friend so badly. Marie-Thérèse snatched the letter from her daughter's hands, ignoring Celeste's cry of protest. She looked at the paper, and what she saw made her sink into the nearest chair. The handwriting was indeed beautiful, elegant curves and flourishes that spoke of an education and refinement from another era. But the content was what troubled her. The letter read, "My dearest Celeste, you cannot know what joy your letter brought to my eternal rest. To be remembered after so many years of silence, to have my name spoken again, with kindness, it is a gift beyond measure. You ask about my life, and I am touched by your interest. I was 17 when the fever took me, in the summer of 1863. I had hoped to marry, to have children of my own, but God had other plans. Now I rest beneath the magnolia tree in the southeastern corner, and the years pass like water over stone, wearing me away until I am almost forgotten. But you have remembered me, sweet child, and for that I am grateful. Please write again. The living world grows dimmer with each passing year, and your letters are like lanterns in the dark. With affection, Marguerite Leblanc." Marie-Thérèse read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling. Marguerite Leblanc. The name stirred something in her memory, a story her own grandmother had told her about a young woman who'd died during the war between the states, a belle from a good family who'd been engaged to a Confederate officer killed at Gettysburg. She'd died of yellow fever just weeks after receiving news of her fiancé's death. Some said of a broken heart as much as the disease. But that was 40 years ago. 40 years, exactly as the letter stated. Jean-Baptiste came home for lunch to find his wife still sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread before her, Celeste pleading to be allowed to write a response. He read the letter himself, his expression growing more troubled with each word. Then he did what any practical man would do. He examined the envelope and paper carefully, looking for signs of a hoax or joke. The postmark was legitimate, stamped in St. Martinville just yesterday, but the paper, when he held it to the light, appeared to have a watermark he'd never seen before, a symbol that looked like a cypress tree intertwined with a cross. The ink, when he touched it gently with a dampened finger, didn't smear like fresh ink should. It seemed to be part of the paper itself, as if it had soaked through from somewhere else. "This is someone's idea of a cruel joke," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Someone is playing on our daughter's innocence. Celeste, did you really write to someone named Marguerite? When? How?" Celeste's lower lip trembled. "I've been writing to lots of them, Papa, the lonely ones in the cemetery. I walk there sometimes after church, and I can feel them. Not all of them, just some. The ones who are sad, who miss being alive. I started leaving letters on their graves, just little notes at first, telling them someone remembers them, and then they started writing back." Jean-Baptiste felt ice in his veins, despite the summer heat. "They? How many have written back?" Celeste counted on her fingers. 5 so far. Marguerite and Monsieur Thibodeau, who died in 1889, and a little boy named Pierre, who died when he was 6, and 2 others who haven't told me their names yet. They just signed their letters with a grateful soul." Marie-Thérèse crossed herself. "Jean-Baptiste, this is impossible. The dead don't write letters. Someone is using our daughter, playing some terrible game." "But who would do such a thing?" Jean-Baptiste asked. "And why?" He looked at his daughter, at her earnest face and pleading eyes. "Celeste, where are these other letters? The ones you received before this?" Celeste ran to her room and returned with a small wooden box, the kind that might hold jewelry or treasured keepsakes. Inside were 4 other letters, each on the same yellowed paper, each written in different handwriting styles, but all with that same quality of age and otherworldliness. Jean-Baptiste read them one by one, his skepticism warring with a growing dread. The letter from Monsieur Thibodeau spoke of his gratitude at being remembered, mentioning specific details about his life, his work as a blacksmith, his death from a heart ailment while shoeing a horse. The letter from the child Pierre was written in a shakier hand, the spelling imperfect, speaking of how lonely it was to be a child forever, how he missed his mother and his toys. The two unsigned letters were shorter, more cautious, as if the writers were testing whether Celeste could truly communicate with them. Jean-Baptiste went to the cemetery that afternoon, taking Celeste with him despite Marie-Thérèse's protests. He needed to verify what his daughter claimed, needed to see with his own eyes whether the graves she mentioned actually existed. They walked through the iron gates of the St. Martinville Cemetery, past weathered tombs and crumbling markers, until Celeste led him to a spot beneath a massive magnolia tree in the southeastern corner. There, partially obscured by fallen leaves and creeping vines, was a marble headstone. Jean-Baptiste cleared away the debris and read the inscription. Marguerite Leblanc, 1846-1863. Beloved daughter, gone too soon. Exactly as the letter had stated, they found the other graves as well. Monsieur Thibodeau's marker in the section reserved for tradesmen, little Pierre's small stone with a carved lamb, dated 1897. The graves existed. The people had been real, but that didn't explain how letters bearing their names were appearing in his daughter's mailbox. That evening, Jean-Baptiste went to see Father Rousseau at Saint-Martin-de-Tours Catholic Church. The priest was an older man, probably in his 60s, who'd served the parish for over 30 years. He knew the history of every family, every scandal, every mystery that had touched St. Martinville in his tenure. Father Rousseau listened to Jean-Baptiste's story with a grave expression, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Jean-Baptiste finished, the priest was silent for a long moment before speaking. The church teaches that the dead rest until the resurrection, Jean-Baptiste. Their souls are with God, or in purgatory, or, God forbid, in the other place. They do not linger in cemeteries. They do not write letters. What you're describing goes against everything we understand about death and the afterlife. But the letters exist, Father. I've read them. They contain information about people who've been dead for years, decades. Information my daughter couldn't possibly know. Father Rousseau stood and walked to his bookshelf, running his finger along the spines until he found what he was looking for. He pulled out an old leather-bound volume and opened it to a marked page. There are precedents, he said slowly, cases throughout church history of communications purporting to be from the dead. Most are dismissed as fraud or delusion, but some, a very few, are harder to explain. He read from the book a case from France in the 1600s, where a young girl claimed to receive messages from deceased villagers. The church had investigated and concluded it was the work of demons, evil spirits impersonating the dead, to gain trust and sow confusion. The girl had been subjected to exorcism, the letters burned, and the matter closed with prayers and penance. You think my daughter is possessed? Jean-Baptiste asked, his voice tight with fear and anger. I think your daughter may be sensitive in ways that make her vulnerable to spiritual deception. The dead rest, Jean-Baptiste. They cannot and do not communicate with the living. Therefore, whatever is writing these letters is not actually the souls of the deceased. It's something else, something pretending to be them. And that is very dangerous. Jean-Baptiste returned home with the priest's words echoing in his mind. But when he told Marie-Thérèse what Father Rousseau had said, his wife's reaction surprised him. She'd been thinking about the letters all day, reading and rereading them, and she'd come to a different conclusion. What if they're not demons, Jean-Baptiste? What if there's something we don't understand about death? About what happens after? These letters, they're not asking for anything wicked. They're not trying to corrupt Celeste or lead her astray. They're just lonely. They're reaching out because someone finally noticed them. Jean-Baptiste wanted to dismiss his wife's theory, but he couldn't. The letters didn't feel evil, strange, impossible, unsettling, yes, but not malevolent. If anything, they radiated a profound sadness, a yearning for connection that was heartbreaking in its intensity. They made a decision. They would allow Celeste to continue the correspondence, but under supervision. Every letter she received would be read by them. Every letter she sent would be approved by them. And if anything changed, if the tone of the letters shifted, or if they asked for anything inappropriate, they would stop immediately and consult with Father Rousseau again. Celeste wrote her response to Marguerite that very evening, sitting at the kitchen table while her parents watched. Her handwriting was that of a child, large and carefully formed, so different from the elegant script she was responding to. She wrote about her day, about the flowers in the garden, about her hope that Marguerite wasn't too lonely anymore. She ended with, "I will keep writing to you, I promise. Everyone deserves to be remembered." Marie-Thérèse addressed the envelope as Celeste directed, Marguerite Leblanc, beneath the Magnolia, St. Martinville Cemetery. She had no idea if such an address would work, if the letter would be delivered or would simply be returned as undeliverable. But the next morning, she walked to the cemetery herself and placed the letter on Marguerite's grave, tucking it beneath a stone to keep it from blowing away. 3 days later, another letter arrived. Marguerite's response was effusive with gratitude, her words painting pictures of what her life had been like, the balls she'd attended, the dresses she'd worn, the dreams she'd harbored for a future that never came. She asked about Celeste's life, wanted to know everything about the modern world of 1903, a world that had moved on without her. More letters came. Pierre, the child, wrote about the games he wished he could still play. Monsieur Thibaudot described the satisfaction he'd taken in his work, the smell of hot metal, the strength required to shape iron, all things he missed from his living days. The anonymous correspondents slowly revealed themselves. One was a woman named Claire, who'd died in childbirth. The other, a man named Etienne, who'd drowned in the Bayou Teche. Celeste faithfully responded to each letter, and word of her unusual correspondence began to spread through St. Martinville. At first, people were skeptical, dismissive, then curious. Then, as the reality of what was happening became undeniable, they grew frightened. Because the letters weren't staying safely in the realm of the impossible anymore. They were bleeding into the physical world in ways that couldn't be ignored. It started with Madame Broussard, an elderly woman who'd been mourning her husband's death for 5 years. She came to the Dupree house one morning, her face pale, carrying a letter in trembling hands. She'd found it on her husband's grave during her weekly visit, she explained. It was addressed to her, in her late husband's handwriting, but she hadn't opened it. She was too afraid. Marie-Thérèse invited her in, and together they opened the letter. It was from Madame Broussard's husband, telling her that he was at peace, that she shouldn't grieve so hard, that he wanted her to live fully in the time she had left. He mentioned specific things, pet names he'd used for her, memories only the two of them would know, details that made Madame Broussard weep with a mixture of joy and terror. "How is this possible?" she asked through her tears. "How can he write to me? Is it really him, or is it, as Father Rousseau says, a demon's trick?" Neither Marie-Thérèse nor Celeste had an answer, but more letters appeared. They were found on graves throughout the cemetery, addressed to the living, written in the hands of the dead. Some brought comfort, messages of love and reassurance. Others brought distress, confessions of sins, requests for forgiveness, revelations of secrets that had died with their keepers. The town was in an uproar. Some people desperately wanted to receive letters from their deceased loved ones and began visiting the cemetery daily, hoping to find envelopes bearing their names. Others were horrified and demanded that Father Rousseau do something to stop this unholy communication. The priest organized a prayer vigil and blessed the cemetery, sprinkling holy water on the graves and reciting prayers of protection. But the letters continued. If anything, they increased in frequency. It seemed that once the channel had been opened, once the dead realized they could reach across the void to the living, they all wanted to speak. The cemetery became a bizarre post office, with letters appearing overnight on graves, waiting to be discovered and delivered. Celeste was at the center of it all. She didn't write all the letters. The dead seemed to have found their own way to communicate, once she'd shown them it was possible. But she remained the conduit, the child who'd first bridged the gap. People came to the Dupree house at all hours, some begging her to contact specific deceased relatives, others demanding she stop whatever she'd started. Jean-Baptiste tried to shield his daughter from the chaos, but it was impossible. The entire town was consumed by the phenomenon. Families were torn apart by revelations in the letters. Old feuds were reignited. Secrets that should have stayed buried came to light. A man discovered his late father's letter confessing to a crime. A woman learned from her deceased mother's letter about a sibling she'd never known existed, given up for adoption before she was born. The dead, it seemed, had no more use for the polite lies and careful omissions that governed the living. The situation reached a crisis point in late July, a prominent family in St. Martinville, the Beaumonts, received a letter from their patriarch, who'd died the previous year. In it, he confessed that the family fortune had been built on fraud, that he'd embezzled money from business partners, that their wealth was stolen. The scandal rocked the town and ruined the family's reputation overnight. Auguste Beaumont, the dead man's son, was furious. He confronted Jean-Baptiste in the street, accusing Celeste of fabricating the letters, of destroying his family with lies. When Jean-Baptiste defended his daughter, Auguste struck him. A crowd gathered, taking sides, and what started as a confrontation between two men nearly became a riot. The mayor, Monsieur Daigle, called an emergency town meeting. The entire community crammed into the courthouse, voices raised in anger and fear. Some demanded that Celeste be sent away, institutionalized, anything to stop the letters. Others argued that she was innocent, that she couldn't control what the dead chose to write. Father Rousseau stood and called for calm, but even he seemed at a loss for what to do. It was then that the most disturbing development occurred. A young man named Henri Guidry stood up in the back of the courthouse. He was pale and shaking, barely able to speak. He held up a letter and said in a trembling voice, "This is from my brother, Lucien. He died 2 months ago, drowned in the bayou. Everyone thought it was an accident. But this letter says it wasn't. This letter says he was murdered." The courthouse erupted. Henri continued, shouting over the din. "The letter names his killer. It describes what happened. My brother is asking me to seek justice, to make sure his murderer doesn't go free." Monsieur Daigle demanded to see the letter. It was read aloud to the assembled crowd. Lucien Guidry's letter, in handwriting his family confirmed was his, stated that he'd been struck from behind while walking home one night, then pushed into the bayou to drown. He named Philippe Marchand, a man he'd had a business dispute with, as his killer. Philippe, who was present in the courthouse, jumped to his feet, denying everything. But the letter was detailed, specific. It described the weapon used, a section of iron pipe, and said it had been thrown into the bayou afterward. It gave the exact location. The sheriff organized a search party that very night. They dragged the bayou where Lucien's letter indicated, and they found it. An iron pipe, heavy enough to crush a skull, with traces of what looked like old blood. Philippe Marchand was arrested on the spot. The town was reeling. If the letters could accuse the living of crimes, if they could serve as testimony from beyond the grave, what did that mean? How could you defend yourself against an accuser who was dead? How could you cross-examine a letter? The legal and moral implications were staggering. But more than that, people began to fear what secrets might be revealed about themselves. How many people had wronged someone who'd since died? How many carried guilt for actions they thought were buried with the people they'd harmed? The letters had become weapons, tools of vengeance wielded by the dead against the living. Father Rousseau made a decision. He went to the Dupree house and spoke with the family privately. "The letters must stop," he said. "This has gone too far. Whatever Celeste did to open this channel of communication, she must close it. The dead must be returned to silence." But Celeste, when consulted, said something that chilled everyone present. "I can't close it, Papa. I didn't really open it. I just knocked on the door, and they heard me. Now they know someone is listening, and they won't stop trying to be heard. Even if I never write another letter, even if I never visit the cemetery again, they'll find other ways. They've been silent for so long. And now they have a voice. They won't give that up willingly." Marie-Thérèse clutched her daughter to her chest. "What have we done? What has this child unleashed?" Abigail Hebert, an elderly woman who claimed to be descended from a long line of traiteurs, the traditional Cajun healers and folk practitioners, came forward with a proposal. She said there might be a way to close the channel, but it would require a ritual, something drawn from old knowledge that predated the church. Father Rousseau was deeply uncomfortable with this suggestion, but he was also pragmatic. If the church's prayers and blessings hadn't worked, perhaps older methods might. Abigail came to the Dupree house on a moonless night in early August. She brought with her bundles of herbs, including vervain and angelica root, a bowl of spring water, and salt from the Gulf. She instructed Celeste to gather all the letters she'd received and written, every piece of correspondence with the dead. In the garden behind the house, Abigail built a small fire. One by one, Celeste placed the letters into the flames, whispering apologies as each one burned. "I'm sorry, Marguerite. I'm sorry, Pierre. I'm sorry to all of you. But this has to end," Abigail chanted in Old French, words that might have been prayers, or might have been something older, passed down through generations of women who'd served as the interface between the living and the spiritual world. She sprinkled the herbs and salt into the fire, creating smoke that smelled sharp and cleansing. She had Celeste wash her hands and face in the spring water, symbolically cleansing herself of the connection to the dead. Finally, as the last letter burned to ash, Abigail spoke directly to the spirits. "You have been heard. Your words have reached the living, but the channel must now close. Return to your rest. Release this child. Go back to silence, but know that you were remembered." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a wind rose, despite the stillness of the summer night. It swirled through the garden, scattering the ashes of the burned letters, extinguishing the fire. Celeste gasped and swayed on her feet. Marie-Thérèse caught her daughter as the child's knees buckled. When Celeste opened her eyes again, something had changed. The darkness that had seemed to pool in her gaze, the sense of depth and otherworldliness that had clung to her since the letters began, was gone. She looked like an ordinary 8-year-old child again, tired and confused, but present in a way she hadn't been for months. The next morning, Jean-Baptiste went to the cemetery. He walked among the graves, looking for new letters, for any sign that the dead were still trying to communicate. He found nothing. The graves were silent. Whatever connection Celeste had established, Abigail's ritual seemed to have severed it. But the effects of those months of communication couldn't be undone. Philippe Marchand went to trial for the murder of Lucien Guidry. His lawyer argued that a letter from a dead man couldn't be admitted as evidence, that it was hearsay at best, fraud at worst. But the physical evidence, the iron pipe recovered from the bayou, combined with testimony about Philippe's financial dispute with Lucien, was enough. He was convicted and sentenced to prison. The Beaumont family never recovered from the revelations in their patriarch's letter. They sold their holdings and left St. Martinville, unable to bear the shame and the suspicion of their neighbors. Other families fractured under the weight of secrets revealed. Some relationships healed as confessions from the dead allowed forgiveness for old wrongs. But the social fabric of the town was irreparably altered. As for Celeste, she seemed to remember very little of the details of what had happened. She recalled writing letters and receiving responses, but the content had faded from her memory, like a half-remembered dream. She never spoke about Marguerite or Pierre, or any of the others again, and when pressed, she would simply say she didn't want to think about it anymore. The Dupree family tried to return to normal life, but normalcy proved elusive. People in St. Martinville looked at them differently now, with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and fear. Some blamed them for the chaos the letters had caused. Others were grateful for the closure or truth the letters had provided. Few could look at Celeste without feeling deeply unsettled. In November of 1903, Jean-Baptiste made a difficult decision. The family would leave St. Martinville. They would start fresh somewhere else, somewhere their daughter wasn't known as the child who'd spoken with the dead. They moved to New Orleans, where they could disappear into the anonymity of a larger city. Before they left, Marie-Thérèse visited the cemetery one final time. She went to Marguerite's grave and stood there for a long while, remembering the letters her daughter had shared, the poignant words of a young woman who'd died too soon and been forgotten too long. She whispered a prayer for Marguerite's soul and placed a small bouquet of flowers on the grave. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a small piece of paper, tucked beneath the corner of the headstone, fluttering in the breeze. Marie-Thérèse's heart hammered as she reached for it. It was a letter, addressed to Celeste, in that familiar flowing script. But she didn't open it. Instead, she took it home, and without reading it, burned it in the kitchen stove. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. The Dupree house in St. Martinville stood empty after they left. It was put up for sale, but no one would buy it. People claimed it was cursed, that it was a nexus point between the living and the dead, that anyone who lived there would be vulnerable to the same communications that had plagued Celeste. The house fell into disrepair, windows breaking, paint peeling, the garden becoming overgrown. And then, in 1907, something unprecedented happened. People began finding letters inside the abandoned house. Not letters that had been mailed or delivered, but letters that simply appeared, lying on the dusty floor, or on the kitchen table, or on the mantelpiece. They were addressed to various residents of St. Martinville, from deceased relatives, continuing the conversations that had been cut short 4 years earlier. The town was horrified. Father Rousseau performed another blessing of the house, but it had no effect. The letters continued to appear. Finally, Monsieur Daigle, still mayor, made an executive decision. If the house was the conduit, if it was somehow facilitating this communication between realms, then the house itself must be dealt with. But destroying it seemed wrong and potentially dangerous. What if destroying the conduit trapped spirits between worlds? What if it made things worse? So instead, they sealed it. The windows were boarded from the outside, heavy shutters installed and nailed shut. The doors were barred and locked, the chimneys capped, every opening blocked. And then, in a measure that seemed extreme, but which everyone agreed was necessary, they built a fence around the entire property, a tall iron fence with a locked gate, and they posted signs warning people to stay away. The house became a local legend, a cautionary tale. Children dared each other to climb the fence and peek through the boarded windows, claiming they could see shadowy figures moving inside or hear whispers in languages they didn't understand. Adults crossed the street rather than walk past the property, especially at night. Over the years, there were occasional reports of letters still appearing, somehow escaping the sealed house. They would be found on doorsteps or tucked into mailboxes, always in that yellowed paper, always in the handwriting of someone who'd died. The recipients were faced with a choice: read the letter and risk whatever consequences came, with knowing what the dead wanted to say, or burn it unread and live with the uncertainty. Most chose to burn them unread. The initial desperate desire to hear from deceased loved ones had been replaced by a hard-earned wisdom. The dead had their realm, the living had theirs, and communication between them brought more pain than comfort, more chaos than closure. Celeste Dupree, meanwhile, grew up in New Orleans without incident. She married at 19, had children of her own, lived an unremarkable life. She never told her husband or children about what had happened in St. Martinville, and her parents took that secret to their graves. Jean-Baptiste died in 1925, Marie-Thérèse in 1930, both without ever returning to the town they'd fled. But Celeste carried the weight of those months in 1903 for her entire life, even though the specific memories had faded. She had nightmares sometimes, dreams of endless letters piling up around her, of handwriting that moved and shifted on the page, of voices calling to her from graves. She developed an aversion to cemeteries, never visiting her parents' graves after they died, sending flowers instead. And she was adamant that none of her children ever learned to read or write at too young an age, though she could never quite explain why this mattered so much to her. In 1953, on the 50th anniversary of the letter phenomenon, a researcher from Tulane University named Dr. Marcus Webb came to St. Martinville to investigate the story. By then, most of the people who'd experienced it firsthand were dead, and the town had settled into treating the whole affair as an embarrassing piece of folklore, something that might have happened or might have been mass hysteria fueled by superstition. Dr. Webb interviewed the few remaining witnesses he could find, people who'd been children in 1903 and were now elderly themselves. Their accounts were remarkably consistent, despite being filtered through 50 years of memory. They all remembered the letters, the chaos, the revelations, and the fear. They all remembered Celeste Dupree, the quiet, dark-eyed child who'd somehow become a bridge between worlds. Dr. Webb also examined the sealed house, or tried to. The fence was still there, rusted but intact. The house itself was barely visible through the overgrown vegetation that had consumed the property. He got permission from the town to open the house and investigate, but when the workers began removing the boards from the windows, something happened that made them stop. A smell poured from the house, a smell of old paper and dried flowers, and that same earthy undertone that had characterized the original letters. But more than that, the workers reported hearing sounds from inside, rustling, like papers being shuffled, and whispers, faint but distinct. One worker swore he saw a piece of paper slide under the front door, as if someone inside was trying to deliver it. Dr. Webb bent down to pick up the paper. It was an envelope, addressed in flowing script to Celeste Dupree. The return address read, Marguerite LeBlanc, still waiting. Dr. Webb's hands shook as he held it. He didn't open the letter. Instead, he made a decision that surprised everyone present. He ordered the workers to reseal the house immediately, to restore the boards and locks and barriers. Some things, he said, were better left undisturbed. The letter addressed to Celeste, Dr. Webb brought with him back to New Orleans. Through careful research, he tracked down Celeste, now a 75-year-old grandmother, living quietly in a suburb. He appeared at her door, introduced himself, and showed her the letter. Celeste's face went white when she saw it. She didn't touch it, didn't take it from him. No, she said simply, I don't want to know. Tell me, Dr. Webb, if you open that letter, will it start again? Will the dead begin writing to the living like they did 50 years ago? Dr. Webb admitted he didn't know. The risk seemed too great. Together, they made a decision. They would burn the letter, unread, and hoped that in doing so, they were closing the door one final time. In Celeste's fireplace, watched by both of them, the letter burned. Neither of them looked away until it was nothing but ash. Celeste never spoke to Dr. Webb again after that day, and he honored her wish for privacy. But he did publish a paper about the St. Martinville phenomenon in 1954, carefully worded to present the events as folklore rather than fact, protecting both the town and Celeste from unwanted attention. The paper became a footnote in the study of Southern Gothic legends, read by a few academics, but largely dismissed as an interesting example of mass delusion or collective myth-making. What Dr. Webb didn't include in his paper were the things that troubled him most, the details that suggested something genuine had occurred in 1903. He'd found records in the parish archives that confirmed every person Celeste had supposedly corresponded with, complete with birth and death dates that matched what the letters had claimed. He'd examined the town's transformation in the years following 1903, how property changed hands, how families were destroyed or healed, how the social structure shifted, all in ways that aligned with revelations the letters had supposedly contained. Most disturbing was a journal he'd found in the rectory of Saint Martin de Tours Church, written by Father Rousseau himself. The priest had kept detailed notes about the phenomenon, and his entries grew increasingly troubled as the events unfolded. On August 3, 1903, Father Rousseau had written, I have performed 3 exorcisms in my life. Each time, I felt the presence of evil, a force of malevolence that sought to corrupt and destroy. But with these letters, with this child, I feel something different. Not evil, but something equally troubling. A sadness so vast it feels like standing at the edge of an abyss. The dead are not evil. They are simply lost, and they are calling out to anyone who might hear. What terrifies me is not that they might harm us, but that their grief might be contagious. That it might spread until we all share in the unbearable sorrow of those who have passed beyond life, but cannot fully pass beyond memory. Father Rousseau's final entry about the matter, dated November 10, 1903, just before the Dupree family left town, was even more unsettling. The ritual performed by the traiteur seems to have worked. The letters have stopped. But I fear we have not solved the problem, merely postponed it. The dead now know that the living can hear them. They know that the barrier between worlds is not absolute. And knowing this, will they not continue to seek ways through? We have closed one door, but there are many doors, many potential conduits. I pray that we have not simply moved the problem elsewhere, that in protecting St. Martinville, we have not condemned some other community to face what we have faced. Dr. Prapine. Webb sat with those words for a long time, recognizing the terrible possibility they suggested. What if the phenomenon wasn't limited to St. Martinville? What if it could occur anywhere, needed only the right conditions, the right sensitive individual to serve as a conduit? He began collecting stories from across the South, tales of people receiving letters from the dead, children claiming to communicate with spirits, unexplained correspondence that appeared from nowhere. What he found was disturbing. There were dozens of such stories, scattered across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and beyond. Most were dismissed as superstition or fraud, but the consistency of certain details across different locations and time periods suggested something more. The yellowed paper, the handwriting of the deceased. The specific knowledge contained in the letters, the way the communications would start with a child or someone particularly sensitive, then spread to others. The revelations that destroyed families and communities. Dr. Webb began to suspect that what happened in St. Martinville wasn't unique, but rather the most well-documented example of a phenomenon that occurred regularly, perhaps had always occurred, in the liminal spaces between the living and the dead. And if that was true, then the sealed house in St. Martinville wasn't the end of the story. It was just one chapter in an ongoing narrative about the permeability of the boundary between worlds. He kept his research private, sharing it only with a few trusted colleagues. The implications were too significant, too potentially dangerous, to publish widely. What would happen if people knew that communication with the dead was possible under the right circumstances? Would they seek it out? Would they try to replicate what Celeste had done? And if they succeeded, would it unleash the same chaos and heartbreak that had consumed St. Martinville? Dr. Webb died in 1972, and his research notes were donated to the archives at Tulane University, where they remain to this day, cataloged but rarely accessed. Scholars occasionally stumble across them while researching other topics, and some find the material compelling enough to follow up on. But the trail always seems to go cold. The people involved are long dead. The physical evidence, the letters themselves, were mostly burned decades ago. The sealed house in St. Martinville remains sealed, a slowly decaying monument to events that most people prefer to forget. Celeste Dupre died in 1968 at the age of 73. Her obituary in the New Orleans Times-Picayune was brief, noting her survivors and her work as a homemaker and community volunteer. It made no mention of St. Martinville or the summer of 1903. Her children buried her in a Catholic cemetery in New Orleans, as she'd requested. At the funeral, one of her daughters mentioned that Celeste's final words, spoken just hours before her death, had been strange and unsettling. She'd been lying in her hospital bed, fading in and out of consciousness, when suddenly her eyes had opened wide. She'd looked at something or someone none of the family could see and said, "Marguerite, is it really you? Have you been waiting all this time?" Then she'd smiled, the most peaceful, joyful smile her daughter had ever seen on her mother's face, and whispered, "I'm sorry I stopped writing. I'm so sorry, but I'm here now. We can talk again." Those were her last words. She died moments later, that smile still on her face, her hand reaching towards something invisible. Her daughter, telling this story at the funeral, wept as she said, "I don't know if she was seeing heaven or just dreaming, but she looked so happy, so relieved, like she'd been waiting her whole life for that moment." But there was something else the daughter didn't mention at the funeral, something she only discovered later when going through her mother's things. Hidden in a locked box in Celeste's closet, beneath old photographs and jewelry, was a single letter. The paper was yellowed and fragile. The envelope addressed to Celeste in that same flowing script. It had never been opened. The daughter stood in her mother's empty house, holding this letter that shouldn't exist, and faced the same choice people in St. Martinville had faced 65 years earlier. To read or not to read, to know or to remain in ignorance. She thought about what her mother's last words had been, about Marguerite, who'd apparently been waiting all those years. She thought about the smile on her mother's face as she died. In the end, she made the same choice Dr. Webb had made. She burned the letter unread, but not before she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The postmark on the envelope was dated November 15th, 1968, 3 days before her mother's death, 3 days in the future from when the letter should have been mailed. She told no one about this impossibility. She simply burned the letter, scattered the ashes, and tried to forget. But she couldn't forget, not entirely. For the rest of her life, she wondered what that letter had said. What message had traveled through time and space and the barrier of death to reach her mother? Had it been a warning? An invitation? A final goodbye after 65 years of separation? The questions haunted her, but she never sought answers. Some mysteries, she decided, were meant to remain unsolved. In St. Martinville, The sealed house continued to deteriorate. By the 1980s, it was barely recognizable as a house at all, more a shapeless mound of rotting wood and rusted metal slowly being consumed by Louisiana's aggressive vegetation. The iron fence remained, though sections had collapsed. The warning signs had long since fallen or been stolen as souvenirs. Teenagers would occasionally breach the fence on dares, claiming to hear whispers or see letters sliding out from under doors that had rotted away years earlier. The cemetery, too, retained its reputation. Locals avoided it when possible, especially at night. There were persistent rumors of letters still appearing on graves, though no one admitted to actually reading them anymore. The town had learned its lesson. Whatever the dead wanted to say, however important or urgent their messages might be, the price of listening was too high. In 1991, the town council debated what to do about the Dupree property. It had become an eyesore, a potential safety hazard, and a dark spot on St. Martinville's reputation. Some council members wanted to tear down what remained of the house, clear the lot, and sell the land. Others argued for preserving it as a historical site, a tangible link to an important, if disturbing, piece of local history. The debate became heated. Those in favor of demolition argued that the town needed to move past the events of 1903, that keeping the ruins was like maintaining a shrine to a traumatic period, best forgotten. Those opposed to demolition warned that destroying the house might have unforeseen consequences, that it might release whatever had been contained there, or worse, anger, whatever forces had made the place their conduit. The compromise they reached was to do nothing. The property would be left as it was, but officially designated as condemned and dangerous. No one would be allowed to enter it or develop it. It would be allowed to decay naturally, to eventually return to the earth on its own terms. It was, in essence, a slow motion burial, letting time and nature do what the town was too afraid to do deliberately. Over the decades that followed, researchers and paranormal enthusiasts occasionally requested permission to investigate the property. The requests were always denied. St. Martinville had no interest in revisiting that chapter of its history, no desire to see the story sensationalized or turned into tourist fodder. The town that had once been torn apart by letters from the dead had decided that silence was preferable to any answers investigation might provide. But the story refused to die completely, as such stories never do. It circulated in books about southern hauntings and unexplained phenomena. It appeared on websites dedicated to paranormal mysteries. It was discussed in online forums by people who'd never been to Louisiana, but were fascinated by the idea of communication with the dead. Each retelling added embellishments, removed inconvenient details, shaped the narrative to fit preconceived notions about ghosts or spirits or the afterlife. In these retellings, Celeste became everything from a child medium to a demon-possessed girl to a misunderstood genius. The letters became proof of life after death, or evidence of evil spirits, or elaborate hoaxes, depending on the teller's beliefs. The truth, complex and ambiguous and deeply human, got lost in the mythology. What remained constant across all versions was the central, unsettling question: what if the dead really could communicate with the living? And what if they desperately wanted to? The story of St. Martinville suggested that such communication, even if possible, might not be desirable, that the dead carried burdens the living weren't meant to share, that some separations, however painful, existed for good reason. In 2003, exactly 100 years after the letters first appeared, a small ceremony was held in St. Martinville. A historical marker was placed near the site of the Dupree house, though not so close as to encourage trespassing on the condemned property. The plaque's text was carefully worded. In 1903, events occurred in this area that profoundly affected the community of St. Martinville. This marker commemorates not the events themselves, but the resilience of a town that faced the inexplicable with courage and ultimately chose wisdom over curiosity. The ceremony was attended by descendants of the families involved, scholars who'd studied the phenomenon, and curious locals. There were speeches about the importance of remembering history, even uncomfortable history. There was acknowledgement of the pain and chaos the letters had caused, but also recognition that some good had come from it. Families reconciled, truths revealed, justice served in at least one case. No one mentioned that letters had been appearing again in the weeks leading up to the centennial. They were found on graves throughout the cemetery, just as they had been a century earlier. They were all addressed to descendants of the people Celeste had originally corresponded with. And they all carried the same message, written in various hands, but with remarkable consistency. We remember. We are still here. We are still waiting. The recipients of these centennial letters, by unspoken agreement, brought them to the ceremony and burned them together in a fire pit that had been prepared for the occasion. As the letters burned, sending ash and smoke into the Louisiana sky, the assembled crowd was silent. They were performing a ritual of closure, hoping that by collectively refusing to read the messages, by choosing silence over revelation, they could close the door Celeste had opened a century ago. Whether they succeeded is impossible to say. The dead keep their secrets, and the living keep theirs. But in the years since that centennial ceremony, reports of letters appearing in St. Martinville have become rare. Perhaps the message was received, the choice respected, or perhaps the dead simply moved on, finding other doors, other sensitive souls, other ways to breach the barrier between their realm and ours. The story of Celeste Dupre and the letters from the dead lives on, not as history, but as legend, not as fact, but as cautionary tale. It reminds us that some silences should not be broken, that some questions should not be asked, and that the desire to communicate with those we've lost, however understandable, can lead to consequences we're not prepared to face. In libraries and archives across Louisiana, in university collections and private holdings, fragments of the story remain. Letters that were saved instead of burned, though their contents are rarely read. Photographs of Celeste as a child, her dark eyes staring at the camera with that unsettling depth. Documents detailing the chaos of 1903, the trials and scandals and broken families. Research notes from scholars who tried to explain or understand what happened. But none of these fragments can fully capture what occurred. None can convey the terror and wonder of a town confronting the impossible, of families receiving messages from beyond the grave, of a child who became a bridge between worlds without fully understanding what she'd done. The truth, if there is such a thing in a story like this, lies somewhere between the documented facts and the mythology that's grown around them. Celeste Dupre was a real child who lived in St. Martinville in 1903. Letters did appear, addressed from the dead to the living. The town was changed by these events in ways that were recorded and remembered. But whether the letters were genuinely from the deceased or products of some other phenomenon, collective delusion, fraud, or something we lack the framework to properly understand, remains ultimately unknowable. What we can say with certainty is that the story resonates because it touches something universal. We all lose people we love. We all wish we could speak to them one more time, hear their voices, know they're at peace, receive forgiveness, or grant it. The letters promised that possibility, and in doing so, revealed both the best and worst of human nature. The desperate need for connection, the willingness to believe, the vulnerability of grief, but also the courage to let go, the wisdom to know when silence is better than speech, the strength to choose the unknown over dangerous certainty. The sealed house in St. Martinville, now little more than a memory beneath the undergrowth, stands as a monument to that choice. The choice to stop listening, even when the dead were speaking. The choice to accept death's finality, even when it seemed that finality might be breached. The choice to protect the living, even at the cost of abandoning the dead to their loneliness. It's a choice each generation must make anew when confronted with the possibility of communication beyond the grave. And if the story of St. Martinville teaches us anything, it's that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for the dead is to let them rest, to carry them in our hearts, rather than trying to pull them back to our world. To honor their memory with our lives, rather than seeking their voices in letters that may promise comfort, but deliver only chaos. The cemetery in St. Martinville remains, its graves silent now, its dead at rest. The magnolia tree where Marguerite Leblanc was buried still stands, ancient and massive, its roots probably intertwined with her bones by now. People visit sometimes, drawn by the story, hoping for some sign or sensation that would confirm the tale. But the graves offer nothing more than graves have ever offered: stone and earth, and the irrefutable fact of absence. and perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps the dead spoke because someone finally listened, and having been heard, they can now be truly silent. Perhaps Celeste's act of childhood compassion, reaching out to the lonely dead, gave them what they needed: recognition, remembrance, acknowledgement that they had lived and mattered. And perhaps in giving them that, she also gave them permission to finally let go of their attachment to the living world. Or perhaps the silence is only temporary, and somewhere, in some other town, some other sensitive child is picking up a pen, writing a letter to someone who's been dead for decades, knocking on that door between worlds, unaware of what might answer. The pattern repeats because human nature doesn't change. Loneliness, grief, the desire for connection, these are constants across time and space. And as long as the living feel these things, and the dead remember them, the possibility of that door opening again remains. The sealed house may be gone, crumbled to nothing, but the phenomenon it represented continues to exist in the realm of possibility. Not as something supernatural necessarily, but as something deeply human, the refusal to accept that death is the end of relationship, the hope that love can transcend the grave, the terrible risk inherent in getting what we wish for. St. Martinville today is a charming town, proud of its Cajun heritage, its connection to the Evangeline story, its place in Louisiana history. The events of 1903 are mentioned, if at all, as a curious footnote, a strange bit of local color that might or might not have happened the way people remember. The town has moved on, built over its past, chosen to focus on less troubling aspects of its story. But on certain nights, when the humidity hangs heavy and the moon is dark, when the cypress trees drip with moss and the bayou whispers its ancient secrets, people in St. Martinville still check their mailboxes with a certain trepidation. They still glance at envelopes with yellowed paper and unfamiliar handwriting with a mixture of curiosity and dread. They still wonder, in the quiet hours when defenses are down, whether the dead really do rest peacefully, or whether they're simply waiting for someone to listen, for another Celeste to open the door. And in homes across the South, in places far from St. Martinville, there are still boxes hidden in attics and closets, containing letters that were never read, envelopes addressed from people who should not be able to write. They sit in darkness, their messages unknown, their promises or threats or desperate pleas sealed behind paper and wax, and the recipient's fear of knowing. They wait, as the dead wait, as we all ultimately wait, for someone brave or foolish enough to break the silence. The choice remains ours, as it was Celeste's, as it was her mother's, as it was the town's. To read or to burn, to listen or to seal our ears, to reach across the divide or to respect its boundaries. There is no right answer, only consequences we must be prepared to live with, whichever path we choose. And if you find yourself holding a letter written in handwriting you recognize from someone who's been dead for years, if you see that yellowed paper and smell, that mixture of dried flowers and earth and old ink, remember St. Martinville. Remember Celeste Dupree. Remember that communication with the dead might be possible, but that doesn't mean it's wise. Some doors are closed for good reason. Some silences are merciful. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The dead have their world, and we have ours. In the space between lies, only sorrow and longing, and the dangerous hope that love can conquer even death. But as the people of St. Martinville learned, some conquests come at too high a price, and some loves are better honored in memory than pursued beyond the grave. If this story has left you contemplating the thin veil between worlds, wondering about the letters that might arrive bearing impossible postmarks, then you understand why these tales must be told. Subscribe to Shadow Bloodline, where we explore the boundaries between the living and the dead, between the possible and the impossible, between the comfort of ignorance and the terror of knowledge. These stories from the shadows of history remind us that some questions are more important than their answers, and some mysteries should be honored rather than solved. Subscribe now and continue this journey with us into the places where reality bends and the dead refuse to stay silent.